Let Europe burn.
The system did not trust you. The mission began with a lie. Was it life, or was it the assignment? There were two choices. Would you betray your friends, or would you give up your family's address? This was not a decision of survival. This was the heaviest bargain imposed by fate. Betrayal, neglect, or was the collapse coming from within? A new trap was set. Even the mistakes were flawless. So what was the new rule? Hope is not an operational plan. It was the ruthless yet necessary rule. When do the lost become nameless? Heroism is over. Now all that remains is a blind silence.
London, that winter, wore the color not of fog, but of fear. 1940. The coal smoke surrounding the city mingled with the dust left by German bombers. Every breath of air smelled of loss and uncertainty. Street lamps offered a faint yellow beam of light, but this light, rather than illuminating a weary watchman's steps, emphasized how deep the darkness and shadows he left behind truly were. Among these shadows, the government's biggest secret was growing. Those were the days when hope was running out on the front line. The British War Cabinet, by a direct order from Prime Minister Winston Churchill, established history's most secret and ethically dubious unit, the Special Operations Executive, or S.O.E. Churchill's order was less a strategy document and more a cry of desperation. Set Europe ablaze. The S.O.E. was neither an army nor a navy. It was a shadow organization designed purely for destruction, sabotage, and assassination. From a corporate perspective, the S.O.E.'s purpose was to break the rules of war. That is, to agree to descend into the same moral darkness as the enemy. This was Britain's biggest gamble in its history. The men and women who undertook this dark mission were not ordinary patriots. They were assets with the most valuable skills and the best training. But they were also, in the eyes of the state, its most expendable pawns, sent with a one-way ticket with no guarantee of return. They were trained for only one mission. They were not expected to embark on a second one. This made them single-use heroes. Their successes would remain silent, and their failures would never be recorded in state files. Their lives would be sacrificed for the sake of keeping Britain's conscience clean.
The danger of this mission was evident early in the training phase, which is when trust began to erode even at the highest level of intelligence. While training the agents, the S.O.E. also placed double agents among them without their knowledge. This was an exercise meant to keep the trainees constantly on alert, but it also taught a painful truth. The system itself did not fully trust you. Before going on a mission, the agents learned this: your biggest enemy wasn't just the Gestapo. It could sometimes be the person standing behind you, handing you the code notebook. What the mission truly meant was most felt during the agent's final, fake farewell in London. The greatest luxury a spy could experience was a quiet hour spent with loved ones at home. However, this farewell was not like that of an honorable soldier. The spy had no permission to ever tell their family what they were doing. Officially, they had been transferred to another unit, or they would simply vanish. This was the first corporate lie presented to the family and the first personal betrayal committed by the agent.
Imagine a husband looking into his wife's eyes, yet thinking of the fake death letter he had prepared in his mind. The words written in the letter would be his last, but not the ones in his heart. This was one of the heaviest burdens placed upon the spies. They had to start their mission by lying not only to the enemy, but also to their closest ones. This situation was a permanent wound opened in their souls. The S.O.E.'s training philosophy was a product of this reality. While a soldier is taught to shoot, these men and women were taught how to slow their heart rate when walking past a German officer. They were no longer weapons, but walking secrets. The most critical part of the training was the identity change lessons. They lived in safe London neighborhoods but spoke only French. They deliberately wore out their clothes and learned to project the weariness of a Parisian under German occupation onto their faces. Think about it. You had to change all the habits you had for years, your shrug, the way you lit a cigarette, even your sleeping position, because the slightest inauthentic movement could be the end of you. In the final hours before being sent to France, the agents couldn't escape the feeling of constant surveillance, even in London. This paranoia was an inseparable part of their mission. Every agent had to check themselves 3 times before getting on the plane or submarine from the departure point. First, no British-made cigarette butts, bus tickets, or coins should remain on them. Another thing was that they had to cut off the labels from all their clothes. The last and most critical was checking their own gaze. If an S.O.E. agent's eyes gave away fear or excitement, it meant revealing their identity. This showed how triggered a spy's mind was. Their body had to be in Paris, but their soul in London, in a constant state of alarm. Their war was not only against the Nazis, but a war waged against their own memory. Statistics were merciless. 1 in every 2 agents sent was captured or died on their first mission. Their desperation was nothing more than a statistic in the eyes of the state. So, what was a spy's most valuable asset? A Luger pistol? A secret knife? No. Their most important asset was a small leather-bound notebook they carried with them, the one-time pad or code block note. This notebook was the spy's physical conscience.
Imagine, on every page there is the cipher for the messages you will send for 1 week. If you don't tear up and burn that page after using it, there is a risk of every message you send being deciphered. This meant endangering the lives of hundreds of resistance fighters, perhaps the entire network. The anecdote that highlights the rising tension and the seriousness of the spy's life was how the notebooks were concealed. Agents carried these pads not in their uniforms or shoes, but in the lining of their vests, sometimes in secret pockets sewn inside the sleeves of their jackets. These pockets were not the first places to be checked during an enemy search. However, this secrecy also complicated the final task, the mission to destroy the notebook. Imagine the flames of the notebook a spy hastily burns just seconds before a German patrol breaks down the door. As every encrypted word turned into smoke and dispersed into the air, a dried fragment of a remaining page could be enough to expose the entire secret. The spy's fear was not being caught by the enemy. His fear was failing to destroy the entire notebook at the moment of capture. A single page of the notebook falling into German hands would not only make him a traitor to his country, it would also condemn the entire network he left behind, the entire resistance, to death. This notebook was his life and the security of his country. Neither a weapon nor jewelry, just a secret composed of paper sheets containing encrypted silence. And the moment arrived. Paris. There was no moonlight, only the smell of damp grass and the sound of a distant German patrol. The spy quickly buried his parachute. He reached a humid attic on the edge of a village. The green light of the setup radio turned on. A final signal was sent to London. Arrived. Started work. This was an encrypted way of saying, "We haven't lost our lives yet." After this first signal, the radio fell silent. How long would this silence last? A day? A week? They didn't know. The S.O.E. headquarters in London was prepared for this silence. They were operating in dangerous waters. Not receiving news from the radio was normal. But when the S.O.E. headquarters in London started receiving a signal again from the same radio frequency a week later, this time there was a strange, unsettling tone in the voice. Was this signal a desired confirmation or the start of an enemy trap? The silence had ended, but what replaced it was the voice of unreliability. If you recall, we discussed that a spy's greatest fear was not being caught, but failing to destroy the one-time pad. However, in London, the situation was more complicated for the radio operators receiving the signal. That signal received a week later, the started work message, should, as a rule, have brought relief, but it didn't.
First of all, the most experienced listening specialists in this field knew that every agent had a unique pianist's touch, meaning the rhythm of tapping the Morse code was as personal as a fingerprint. The letters in the incoming signal were correct, the cipher was solved. However, the vibration in that signal, the agent's soul, was gone. It was as if the machine was speaking, not a human. This was the first whisper of unreliability. In the dimly lit rooms of the listening stations in London, the operators on the night shift felt a deep shiver as they transcribed this soulless signal. One leaned over and whispered into his colleague's ear, "This is not our man. The voice belongs to a copy. Too regular, too clean. Our men couldn't be this fearless and flawless." However, this personal paranoia did not dare enter official reports, for the burden of these operators was not just to crack the code, they also had to believe in the infallibility of the system. Their job was to confirm, not to question. This was the first psychological barrier S.O.E. created within itself. At the S.O.E. headquarters in London, this eerie doubt was brought to the table. So, what could be done because of a mere suspicion? Taking the decision to trust this signal and withdraw an entire operation was almost impossible on the government's desk, because with hopes running out on the front line, this signal was the justification to continue. S.O.E. superiors preferred to see the regularity of the incoming signal as proof of success. This was bureaucratic blind faith. Ignoring the signal was putting hundreds of lives at risk, but not believing the signal was destroying the last remaining hope.
This suspicion in London, the difference in the pianist's touch, should have actually triggered the return signal rule. This rule was a deliberate mistake made by a wireless operator upon capture to signal danger. But the S.O.E. management insisted on not applying this rule. Why? Because according to London, the fact that the agent was captured and Funkspiel had begun could not be confirmed by a few pianists' rhythm deviations. Official authorities assumed that everything should be perfect. This situation showed us the greatest paradox of the war. Bureaucracy is sometimes more dangerous than reality. Their stubbornness stemmed from the corporate arrogance that said, "Our wireless operators do not make mistakes." This corporate arrogance became the enemy's greatest ally. It was because of this blind faith that one of history's biggest fiascos began. To show the mass scale of this tragedy, let us call it Operation Wasp. Those fake signals coming over the radio told London that everything was fine. Imagine the spies parachuting in one after another, trusting these signals. Each one, like a white shroud hanging from the night sky, landed directly into the Gestapo's arms. The German intelligence had deciphered all of the S.O.E.'s communication codes thanks to the one-time pads of the first spies they captured. This was a radio game, or Funkspiel. London was completely unaware that they had been speaking with their own enemy for months. The Germans were receiving encrypted instructions from London, which means they learned S.O.E.'s plans. Then, using the same signals, they sent back feedback, saying, "Instruction received, everything is fine." For months, S.O.E. had been comforted by the voice of its own executioner. The Gestapo's success in this game was not limited to just cracking codes. They also aimed to break the agent's psychology. Imagine the cold, damp cell where the spy was placed after capture. Using Funkspiel, the Gestapo inflicted severe punishment on the captured agent. For example, they would write a personal instruction on the agent's cell wall, an instruction that only the agent could know, which had arrived from London just an hour earlier. The agent thus realized that he had been forced to betray his own cause, his own country.
While executing Funkspiel, German intelligence did not only crack the code, they also deciphered S.O.E.'s logistics codes. For instance, if a message from London said 5 boxes of cigarettes will be dropped at point X, the Germans received these cigarettes on time and immediately thanked London over the radio. This was a multi-dimensional theater. The Germans were not only receiving the messages, by also seizing the supplies sent, they had cut off every vein that physically fed the agent's resistance network. The major role undertaken by Funkspiel was not just to steal information, it was also to crush the agent's morale. The Gestapo sometimes forced the captured agent to send their own fake signals. The agent was offered 2 choices: either send fake messages to his British friends or be forced to write down his family's address in London. This was not a decision of survival, but a decision to choose the type of betrayal. The psychological difficulty experienced by these agents was much heavier than the pain of a soldier who died on the front line, for they were forced to lure their own friends into a trap with their own hands. The number of losses began to increase. In a matter of weeks, more than 50 agents had vanished. The walls of the S.O.E. headquarters in London were filling up with lists bearing the names of the single-use heroes. But the most painful betrayal came from within. Some agents who were actually captured and still alive managed to send danger signals to London by escaping Gestapo surveillance or by pretending to be captured. There were oddities and deliberate mistakes in these signals. These were the shouts of "Don't believe me," sent by the agent at the risk of his own life.
The rejection of these cries is the darkest point of our story. A spy under Gestapo surveillance had risked his life to intentionally add a letter error to the cipher. This was meant to tell London, "This message is invalid, there is a trap." However, the clerk at the S.O.E. desk in London attributed that mistake to the pianist's fatigue and corrected it while cleaning the signal. Because the fake signals sent by the Germans were so flawless, so British, S.O.E. personnel preferred the comfortable order of their own system over the desperation of their own agents. S.O.E. believed so strongly in the perfection of its own system that it accepted and rejected the disorganized and panicked last cries for help from its agents as a system failure. This was the greatest tragedy of the lost spies. London sacrificed the chance to save its own agents to its own bureaucratic order and obsession with not trusting the internal voice. Silence had prevailed. All that remained were hundreds of lost names. But was the reason behind these disappearances merely a German success? Or was there a much bigger betrayal coming from within the system itself, a mistake solely made by S.O.E.? When the signals from Germany suddenly stopped, meaning S.O.E. could no longer even hear the voice of its own executioner, London's bureaucratic armor finally cracked. There was no longer silence in the headquarters, but a deafening chaos. The list of missing agents had exceeded 50, meaning the number of single-use heroes who were not expected to return had long passed the tolerance limit. Until that day, the bureaucracy could label the situation as operational loss. However, a mass loss of this scale in such a short period meant not just a fiasco, but a corporate annihilation. This situation created an earthquake effect at the highest level of the British government, and the lie could no longer be sustained. When the investigation began, the darkest front of the war opened up, a spy hunt conducted by British intelligence within itself. Whispers rose in the corridors of Whitehall, the government buildings. S.O.E. had not only fought against the Germans, but had also entered into a huge rivalry with the British Internal Security Service, MI5. MI5's suspicion was clear. A disaster of this magnitude must have been the work of a mole leaking from within, rather than an external Funkspiel. Records were scrutinized, and the desks of executives were searched. Every single S.O.E. employee, everyone who had been regarded as a hero until that day, became a potential traitor. This paranoia was heavier than the fear felt by the spy on the front line, because the enemy was known on the front line. But here, behind the safe walls in London, there was the thought that the colleague handing you the code notebook when you looked behind you might be a traitor. Every phone conversation at S.O.E. was monitored, and every document was checked twice. The culture of accusation completely crushed the operational culture. S.O.E.'s executives preferred to find a traitor among them and shift the responsibility onto him, instead of confronting the reality of Funkspiel. Management was blaming the lower ranks, and the lower ranks were afraid to blame the system itself. With the start of the mole hunt, the focus quickly shifted to the highest ranks. No longer a simple wireless operator, but the directors who made operational decisions, who decided the agent's fate, were now suspects. The preparation of the suspect list was entirely the product of pressure and political infighting. First, among the suspects, were those who initiated the operations. Another group were the high-ranking communications officials who ignored the first signals regarding Funkspiel. This witch hunt showed how rotten the corporate structure was, because being part of the system meant being the enemy. S.O.E. was looking for a dispensable scapegoat to conceal its internal mistakes and bureaucratic blind faith. Suspects were picked up from their homes at midnight and interrogated, experiencing the harshest form of psychological warfare in the interrogation rooms.
As the internal investigation progressed, the horror of Funkspiel began to surface. An interrogated wireless operator, the one who received that soulless signal, confessed this to his superior. The rhythm in that signal was never ours. I wrote a note on the margin of the paper to correct it, but my superior said, "Clean the record." This confession was not a simple mistake, but conscious negligence, because corporate order was more valuable than the agent's life. This showed that S.O.E.'s upper management knew the agents were in danger. However, they chose to protect their own reputation instead of stopping the operations. The mole might not have been inside, but the betrayal was the system itself. The most devastating finding of the internal investigation was a note written in a director's handwriting. The note read, "We cannot stop the operation until we receive another signal. The political cost is higher than the agent cost." This sentence proved that the lives of hundreds of people, the fate of the single-use heroes, were seen as a political budget item. Directors ignored the risk of agents losing their lives in France, fearing they would lose their own seats in London. This document officially ended the mole hunt, because now the culprit was not a single person, but S.O.E.'s cold, inhumane corporate structure. The betrayal was no longer leaking information, but inaction. S.O.E. could have noticed the existence of Funkspiel months ago. However, they chose to ignore this reality that would damage their reputation. This was a political decision made at the cost of hundreds of lives. With the documentation of this corporate irresponsibility, the mole hunt slowed down, because the culprit was not a single person, but the entire S.O.E. operational hierarchy.
The political consequences of this massive fiasco were inevitable. S.O.E. did not officially disappear completely. However, its power was stripped due to loss of reputation and the supremacy of MI5. In fact, S.O.E. had self-destructed. This incident became a turning point in British intelligence history. The issue was no longer just defeating the enemy, it was also about making its own system reliable. The analysis of these events laid the foundation for modern intelligence.
First, the negligence in the use of one-time pads was corrected. Now, one-time pads were automatically invalidated at the slightest suspicion of an agent's capture. Another thing was that a new, more rigorous system was established for the analysis of the pianist's touch. This was ensured by the confirmation of 2 or 3 independent operators, not just one. Most importantly, the fact that the enemy could use psychological warfare methods like Funkspiel was accepted. This was even reflected in the code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park. The collapse of S.O.E. actually became the catalyst for institutions like MI6 and G.C.H.Q. to progress more cautiously, more suspiciously, and more technically. This was the story of how a failure sowed the seeds of a victory. After this disaster, the mindset of the British intelligence agencies radically changed. MI5 and MI6, unlike S.O.E., focused on the emotionlessness of information. The new rule was, the data is what the data says. Hope is not an operational plan. The biggest lesson learned from Funkspiel was, what is too regular and too flawless is always a trap. This became the fundamental rule of intelligence analysis. S.O.E. was where the romantic stories of heroism ended. From its ashes, the modern and ruthlessly realistic British intelligence mechanism was born.
When the war ended, the fate of the single-use heroes in our story was the final tragedy of this operation. Even the agents who were captured and survived were not treated as heroes when they returned to Britain due to the secrecy of their missions. Their existence was a reminder of S.O.E.'s shameful mistakes. Many were forgotten, even treated with suspicion by their own country. Think about it. You risked your life for your country, and when you returned, you were seen as a burden carrying the state's dirty secret. Officially, S.O.E. was never held responsible for endangering the lives of the agents. The government covered up this fiasco and buried it in the dusty pages of history. Even their relatives were not informed. This situation taught us this: the real victims of war are not those who died on the front line, but those sacrificed by the system's own belief. The British bureaucracy was blind not only to its enemy, but also to its most valuable assets, its own spies. Funkspiel was a German success. However, the disaster of Operation Wasp was entirely the work of London's corporate arrogance and paranoia. Even decades later, official monuments commemorated only the courage of S.O.E., not its operational fiasco. The government tried to make this tragedy forgotten, but the families of the lost agents never forgot. Even today, many of the agents captured during that period do not have a tombstone, because in official records they are still listed as missing or simply vanished. This is the biggest corporate debt Britain paid to those who sacrificed their lives, the promise of oblivion. The developments concluded with the silence of hundreds of heroes. Their fate is not a military error, but the most painful record of self-inflicted betrayal by an intelligence agency. The new intelligence mechanism born from the ashes of S.O.E., the analytical unit responsible for radio at MI6 and G.C.H.Q., was now miles away from that old romantic heroism era. They were a new kind, emotionless, data-driven, emerging from the mass grave of S.O.E. At the heart of this new order was a face who had experienced that old disaster firsthand. A former S.O.E. communications officer served as the chief analysis specialist at MI6. He might have been one of the operators who received the soulless signal and was forced to carry out his superior's order to clean the record. The burden on his shoulders was not just technical responsibility. It was the weight of hundreds of ghosts. That is, the face of every lost agent appeared in the Morse code burning on the screen. For him, Funkspiel was not an intelligence theory, but the very essence of personal remorse. His new mission was to ensure that old mistake was never repeated. This was the key role of the spy who learned from S.O.E.'s mistakes in the new system. The cost of the S.O.E. fiasco in terms of national security was not just the agents lost. Perhaps more importantly, it was the fact that the enemy knew Britain's military and industrial targets. Using the logistical information they had obtained through Funkspiel, the Germans had been able to even predict the routes of critical U.S. ammunition convoys heading to Britain. Every merchant ship sunk during that period, every lost ton of steel, was directly linked to bureaucratic arrogance in London. S.O.E.'s mistake dealt a direct blow to the country's war effort and supply chain. This situation pushed the new intelligence leadership to the belief that operational error is equivalent to strategic betrayal.
The calendars had moved on. German intelligence knew that Operation Wasp had provided them with a temporary advantage. However, they also knew that the British had now learned about Funkspiel. For this reason, the enemy attempted a more sophisticated version this time: perfect Funkspiel. These new signals were no longer too regular and too clean. On the contrary, the Germans had worked so meticulously that they had intentionally added small human errors to the signals. This was an exact copy of the mistakes that the old S.O.E. mindset in London had attributed to the pianist's fatigue. The enemy's goal was clear: to sabotage the new British rule of analytical suspicion with their old emotional blindness. However, the new G.C.H.Q team strictly adhered to the rule, what is too regular is always a trap, and the data is what the data says. Hope is not an operational plan. While the incoming signals should contain fatigue and confusion, the errors within the signals were too regular in themselves. That is, even the mistakes were flawless. It was here that the new system, which learned from S.O.E., implemented two simultaneous steps. First, the ruthless analysis of rhythm. The former S.O.E. expert analyzed the pianist's touch, the fingerprint of every agent, with a new system where 3 independent operators compared it, not just one. This new protocol proved that the deliberately added irregular errors in the signal did not, mathematically, match the real agent's natural rhythm. The rhythm on the radio felt like a human, but it belonged to the wrong human. That is, the Gestapo had learned to mimic the rhythm not through a machine, but through a captured agent. However, the new system was able to detect the perfection of this mimicry as a flaw.
The other step was the ruthless rigidity in one-time pad management. The moment the incoming signals were identified as fake, the system no longer waited as S.O.E. did. The new rule was simple: if there is suspicion, all active one-time pads are automatically invalidated, and a destruction operation is initiated. This meant that the codes obtained by the Gestapo through Funkspiel instantly became worthless. This ruthless rigidity did not save the agent's life, as he was already captured. However, it saved the network and the operation behind the agent. The system accepted the agent as a single-use hero. However, it prevented the information resulting from his sacrifice from falling into the hands of the enemy. This immediate destruction decision was a definitive measure taken against an old mistake of S.O.E. Because fake signals were believed, Britain had sent explosives to a resistance group they called the Agent Watchmen in Germany, which were destined for a Gestapo safe. The bitter consequence of this was that those resistance fighters were ambushed and executed by the Gestapo when they tried to open the safe. The new MI6 G.C.H.Q mindset never forgot this tragedy. It accepted the fact that a technical error led to a mass execution in the field. Therefore, the new system prioritized protecting operational integrity over human cost. This was not an ethical change, but the result of the instinct for survival. These simultaneous steps deciphered the perfect Funkspiel trap, and the Gestapo's game ended the moment it began. This time, London had defeated the enemy without losing hundreds of lives. This success was the definitive victory of MI6's analytical mindset against S.O.E.'s emotional blindness. However, this victory was cold and without celebration. At the foundation of the new set of rules that ensured success lay the lives of over 50 sacrificed S.O.E. agents. While the new system stated, "The data is what the data says," the former S.O.E. expert whispered, "The cost of this victory was the screams we ignored." The new system did not change the fate of the single-use heroes. It accepted the expendability of their missions and built a victory upon that acceptance. Their silence was no longer a shame. It was the proof of that ruthless yet necessary rule that laid the foundation for the new British intelligence. And the ones who paid the heaviest price for these events were those left behind. The wives and children of the lost agents had neither the right to a martyr's compensation nor a grave visit. They were still simply listed as missing civilians in official records. Furthermore, the biggest lie the state offered them was the cold official letter stating, "The mission involved secrecy. Unfortunately, we cannot disclose details." The families inherited only uncertainty, not honor. Their drama is proof that the state even sacrificed the purest patriotism for the sake of protecting its own secret. This was the moment when S.O.E.'s romantic stories of heroism ended and ruthless realism began.